Chapter 5. As the spade hit the icy earth once more, Yarlin felt another shudder run through the handle into his arms. His fingers were starting to go numb, but the labor had caused the rest of his body to heat under his layered clothing and cloak, until sweat dripped down his back. It wasn't a pleasant combination. Beside him, the dwarf toiled, at least willing to help dig the graves with him after getting the group into this mess. Mira was the only other person nearby, regularly breathing fire into the hole to help thaw the ground enough to keep digging it out. The pit soon became a mess of stones, tree roots, and refreezing mud.
"What possessed you to think we would be the best people to help this town out?"
Yarlin finally said, directing his words at the dwarf. It wasn't a question, but Thorgrim, or whatever he was called, put down his spade anyway and squared up to him.
"Firstly, my goddess would never allow one of her most ardent and faithful believers to become possessed by anything. And secondly, it is our duty as being stronger, more resilient, and with the skills needed to protect and aid those weaker than ourselves. There is far more to life than financial gain, especially when it is so quickly squandered."
Yarlin rolled his eyes, not needing a lecture on how to live life in a way a god of some kind might approve of. If any of the gods actually cared, they'd sort this world out themselves, instead of letting people go hungry, letting murderers live while those who were innocent and only toiled to help people died in their stead. No, he wasn't going to help anyone just out of the goodness of his heart. "I'm sure we can make both align well," Mira said, coming over to them from the hut. "These thugs have been hired by someone with pretty deep pockets." She held out a small pouch.
"Where was that?"
Yarlin asked as she shook out several precious gemstones.
"Under one of the beds, behind some old clothing."
She tucked the precious stones back inside the small purse as both he and the dwarf held out their hands. Looking between them a couple of times, she pushed them into one of her pockets, exaggerating the gesture.
"We'll add them to the stash and split everything up when this is done,"
she said, not losing the grin that was almost permanently fixed on her dragonborn features. The first time Yarlin had seen a dragonborn, he'd almost wet himself. A lad of only 10 summers, but he'd since come to realize that most dragonborn were far gentler than they looked. They had a natural desire to live in harmony, as long as no one around them tried to do anything stupid. Most also appreciated the shinier things in life, like gold and jewels. It seemed Mira was no different. Her eyes had lit up at the sight of the precious gems, and she tucked them back inside her pocket with a care even he didn't afford them usually. Despite the dwarf, Yarlin knew he could do worse than sticking with the group and solving the town's problems. It was also keeping a roof over his head and food in his belly. Getting them back on track, Mira blasted a jet of flame at the inside of the pit again to defrost the next layer of earth, just enough to dig.
"I think we're almost there,"
Thorgrim said as he dug in his spade again to scoop up some more of the mud. Good, Yarlin thought. Burying dead thugs in the middle of winter isn't my idea of fun. Feeling less than happy with the current situation, he thrust the spade in as hard as he could, jarring his arms. A clang reached his ears. Instantly, all 3 of them looked at each other.
"Was that the sound of metal?"
Mira asked, her eyes a little wider. Not answering, Yarlin pulled the spade out and repeated the motion in a slightly different place. It clanged again, reverberating through the handle and into his fingers. Thorgrim came closer, bringing his tool to help. Together, they dug at the small patch until they'd cleared another foot of dirt. Underneath seemed to be some kind of metal panel, but the dirt clung to it and made it impossible to tell exactly what it was.
"It looks like there's something engraved on it."
Thorgrim bent down to look closer, trying to pry some of the dirt off.
"Let me boil some water," Mira said after a moment. "There was a kettle on the stove."
She rushed off before either he or the dwarf could stop her. It was an idea, but in this level of cold, it could lead to the water just freezing on top.
"What do you think it is?"
he asked, more to make conversation than actual curiosity. These things could often be bad. People didn't stick metal in the ground for no reason, but the ground was where you put dead people and things you didn't want. Or treasure. Thorgrim shrugged as he worked outward from the small section they'd uncovered, widening the hole with the spade as best he could. Sooner than expected, Mira returned with the kettle. On the way towards them, she scooped up some snow and stuffed it in the top. Yarlin raised his eyebrows, wondering what she was going to do, until she let it dangle at arm's length and puffed another burst of fire at it. He laughed. It was definitely a much quicker way of heating the water.
Couldn't find any more firewood in the stove, and it's not hot enough after using it earlier, she explained as she handed the kettle to Thorgrim. He grinned and started to pour. The mud trickled away on a small patch, revealing a bronze picture molded into the surface. There wasn't enough displayed for them to work out what it might show, but it proved it was man-made and had been put there for a reason.
"We're going to need a lot more water,"
Thorgrim said as he emptied the last of the warm contents onto the metal. It hadn't managed to clear very much of the surface, and the air was so cold Yarlin could see ice forming in the puddles already. While the three watched, the surface soon frosted over.
"More water alone isn't going to be enough,"
he said, trying to think of a solution.
"What if I heat the metal?"
Mira asked.
"No, it could damage it, or anger one of the gods."
Thorgrim's eyes blazed as he spoke, making both of them raise their eyebrows. Yarlin tried not to roll his eyes at the dwarf's faith. Somebody had to believe in all the random gods around, or he supposed they'd stop existing. Before Yarlin could think of something else to suggest, a sound from the distance made the three of them look up. Stumbling into the clearing were three more thugs, lugging something in a sackcloth between them. When they spotted Mira standing by the side of the pit, they stopped and stared for a few seconds, until they noticed the bodies of their dead comrades. Yarlin swore, realizing his sword and shield were several feet away, and he was ankle-deep in mud. Thorgrim was equally angry. Only Mira was fully armed, and she reacted first, crouching by the pit's edge as she drew her crossbow. The thugs were slow to react, at a similar disadvantage from holding whatever weighed the sacking down, but they still drew swords long before he and Thorgrim could clamber out of the hole they'd been busy digging. Mira exhaled a massive breath of fire, heating the air for a brief moment and making all three men hesitate. Evidently, they weren't bargaining on such a defensive strategy. It bought Yarlin enough time to get onto his knees on the edge. As Thorgrim slipped backwards, he reached to help. In the urgency of the moment, Yarlin's fingers found the collar of the dwarf's shirt and gripped it tight. He hauled the dwarf upwards and forwards until Thorgrim could get a grip before Yarlin let go. Thorgrim grunted but found his feet, leaving the sailor still kneeling in the snow and dirt. Mira fired before either of them could reach their weapons, but she missed, her bolt going wide in the heat of the moment. The men rushed towards Yarlin, evidently feeling his fire-breathing companion and the dwarf were less pleasant targets. He let out another curse word, knowing even his old sailor companions would have blushed to hear it, and dived for his shield, rolling as he snagged it with one hand.
"Sword!"
he yelled, as he tried to get to his feet again, only a little more distance between him and his advancing foe. Dodging to one side of the nearest thug, he glanced at Thorgrim. The dwarf was busy fitting a bolt to his own crossbow. Yarlin growled as he ducked a blade swing meant to cut off his head. At least these idiots weren't very good with their weapons. None of them had seemed particularly effective in battle. It still didn't help him get to his own sword, however.
"I need my sword!"
he yelled again, Mira and Thorgrim choosing to shoot at the other two attackers rather than come to his aid. Backing up, he tried to work his way towards his weapon himself, but his opponent was smart enough to react to that and keep harassing him with swings and thrusts that kept him reversing and dodging away instead of closer. He heard the roar and felt the heat of another flame blast from Mira. A yelp let him know she'd hit her target, but he didn't dare look as he dodged yet another thrust.
"Catch!"
Thorgrim finally replied, lifting and hurling the sword Yarlin normally kept on his belt. Yarlin looked his way, but the sword fell into the snow several feet from him. He let out another frustrated growl, still weaponless. Before he could refocus on his opponent, he felt the sharp sting as a blade sliced across his arm, cutting open his cloak, shirt, and the leather armor he had underneath. Blood splattered the white snow as he hissed in pain. He needed his sword. Mira's fire roared to life again, and this time there was a thwump as another thug fell into the snow. He tried to roll, but it was too late. The fire had caught in his clothes, and the smell of burning flesh filled the valley. Trying not to gag on the foul stench, Yarlin grabbed a handful of snow and hurled it at his attacker. It caught the man off guard and got into his face. The half a second it bought him was enough to finally dance close enough to the sword-shaped pit in the snowdrift. Dropping to his knees, he grabbed the sword and rolled once more. Another thrust came his way, but didn't connect. Instead, the snow got into the wound he already had, making him hiss air out through his teeth. Now one single battle yet with this lot had ended without him getting hurt. It was more than frustrating. With a weapon in hand, and a little distraction from Mira and her flaming breath, Yarlin quickly finished his opponent off, running him through. They both looked at Thorgrim, who stood with his back towards the pit, by the bodies of their earlier foe. His attacker kept slashing towards him, forcing the dwarf to abandon his crossbow and use his warhammer and shield to defend himself. Catching his foot on a dead man's limb, the dwarf toppled backwards. Instead of panicking, he uttered several strange words, and a burst of bright light raced from his hands and hit the final thug full on the chest. It wasn't enough to kill him, but he staggered backwards, giving Thorgrim time to get to his feet. Yarlin hurried over, yelling aloud to draw attention away from the more vulnerable dwarf as he did. Before he could get within striking distance, Mira buried a bolt in the thug's shoulder, and Thorgrim slammed his hammer into the man's chest. There was a crunch of bones as he fell, unable to breathe. Giving him a merciful death was the only sensible next step. There would be no getting information out of any of the men, assuming any of them would even have been willing to talk. With a quick thrust, Yarlin ended the man's life.
"Where did they come from?"
Thorgrim asked as he put his weapon back on his belt. At first, Yarlin didn't respond. Wherever they had come from, he and the others shouldn't have let themselves be caught so unprepared. It had been foolish, and he had yet another wound to show for it. Before he could do anything more than look at the blood-soaked clothing and the wound beneath it, Thorgrim had reached out a hand. Once more, the dwarf muttered several words, and the pain receded, leaving a tingling feeling in its place. By the time Yarlin could get a proper look, there was pink skin where the cut had been, surrounded by drying blood. It wouldn't mend his clothes or armor, however. It was yet another repair he'd need to make, assuming it could be fixed, and he wouldn't need to buy a new leather vest instead. "Looks like we'll need to bury a few more," Mira said as she dragged over one of the bodies and added it to the row they had made.
"Yes, and we'll need to find somewhere else to do it,"
Thorgrim added, walking towards the man Yarlin had finished off. Yarlin considered helping get the third, but as Mira beat him to it, he noticed the first fresh flakes of snow start to fall from the sky. He sighed, not sure this day could get much worse.